All right, I think we can start.
Okay, let's kick it off, Mo.
So today we're talking about the potential possibility of third world war. Why? Because
big scary one, the big scary
the big
question.
scary one, yes. I mean, not like the first two weren't, right?
Yeah.
But certainly we have had major escalation over Syria over the last few days, especially over the weekend. We have now a new player started bombing in Syria, and that's the Turks. They've already had their problems with the Russians after downing a Russian jet fighter. But anyway, the Russian prime minister made some escalating statements this weekend in Munich. He said, look, what is definitely a new Cold War between Russia and the West might escalate into permanent war over Syria if the Turks and the Saudis and others get involved in Syria. And that's our topic today. And you are Dermot.
Yeah.
And Rahila.
Yeah.
And of course, I'm Marwan. And we're going to be taking your questions and comments. And I hope you'll all join in the conversation.
Well, listen, we've had some questions in already, okay, because we kind of floated this out as a topic for discussion. And one of the things that keeps coming up time after time after time is why the hell should the rest of the world care about what's going on in Syria? I mean, yes, of course, we see the refugees, we see all the suffering and the plight and everything else, but is this really a fight that the rest of the world should be involved in?
Well, look, I mean, some 60, 70 years ago, the human race, the human civilization said, never again. We will not see millions of people being killed, dying in front of our eyes. That we just can't afford that. Unfortunately, it happened again in Rwanda, it happened again in Bosnia, and it's happening again apparently in Syria. We have a full-fledged genocide in Syria, and I think the world should care. I think probably the question you're asking is, why should world powers get involved, right?
Well, that's what people are asking about their governments, is why should they get
Exactly. And in so many ways, I mean, China, although Venezuela have sent some cheap oil to to Assad, by the way, for some odd reason. But certainly the old superpowers, Russia and the United States, are getting involved heavily, and they're certainly bombing the heck out of various parts of Syria. And regional powers like Saudi Arabia and Iran are certainly getting involved in Syria. And of course, we add to that the Turks. Now, I'll tell you, Syria has become the geopolitical football par excellence. This is the place where everyone wants to see.
That's the other question we get asked. Why Syria? Why Syria? Why not Iraq? Why not Libya? Why not other places? Why Syria?
Well, they've tried something over Libya. They sort of went along, right? Just 4 years ago. Russians went along with the United States over Libya, and they feel like they've been betrayed because instead of going in there in a humanitarian mission to save the Libyan peoples, Russia blames the West for changing regime in Libya. And now they're saying, look, that's it. You've had your chance. You screwed up Libya. We're not going to let you screw it up Syria. So Russians are saying bluntly, look, we're not there to save Assad. We just want to make sure that the country does not fall into chaos, right? So that's why the Russians, at least that's what they say they're getting involved.
That's not why they're there, is it?
Well, I tell you what, let's just agree that it's not for oil, right? I mean, they're not really fighting for the 300,000 barrels of oil that
Russia's got plenty of oil that it can't sell anyway.
Exactly. But certainly, as I said, it has become political football where everyone flexes their muscles. Now, you can add one important factor. I'm sure you got a lot of questions about that, which is ISIL, Daesh, right? The Daesh that grew in Iraq and mutated in Syria has become a formidable force. It's controlling major swaths of territories both in Syria and Iraq. And everyone is there now, if not to fight Assad, definitely to fight Daesh.
So that's one main question now, which is asking, Russia's first, when they said that they were actually going to go into Syria, it was to combat terrorism and obviously to combat Daesh. What we do know is a lot of people are also asking about why is Russia now obviously targeting majority of the opposition fighters in Syria, and now what are the impacts that would obviously have on the US supporting the rebels and so forth.
That actually goes back to what Dermot just said.
Just to add to that point, because this is something which people really don't get. Okay, they're always talking about bombing ISIS. Right now in Aleppo, There is some ISIS in Aleppo, we know, here at Al Jazeera, we've reported on that, but most of ISIS and Daesh are actually elsewhere. They're in Raqqa.
Right.
Yeah.
But the Russians seem to be concentrating, and the Assad regime is concentrating their energies and their attacks right now on Aleppo.
Right.
So is it about Daesh? I mean, that's the...
Look, I mean, certainly the last report I've seen, trusted report to be sure, says that only 12% of the Russian bombings is against Daesh, and the rest is against the other Syrian opposition that also Moscow considers to be terrorists. And here, really, I mean, we're back to the issue of terrorists. At the United Nations, they haven't agreed to the term, right? What the definition of terrorism is. And like the first UN envoy to Syria, or the second, Ibrahim said, look, I mean, terrorists, really, who's the terrorist? I mean, can anyone really look me in the face and says that the Assad regime did not use violence against civilians for political ends? I mean, that's sort of the minimum requirement for terrorism, right? I mean, did any force in Syria did not go on after civilians, threatened with the use of force or used force for political ends? I'm sure everyone did. But certainly the biggest chunk goes to the Assad regime. So to focus on Daesh, and just for all of us to remind, each other of this. When this whole thing started, there was peaceful opposition in Syria. There was no Daesh. There was no Daesh when the Syrian uprising started, when what's so-called the Syrian revolution started. So now the idea that all effort needs to go in the fight against Daesh, of course, is a bit of a betrayal, if not a huge betrayal for the Syrian people who have been trying to struggle against a dictatorship that lasted over 4 decades. So now the big question is, can you really fight Daesh, degrade and defeat Daesh, as President Obama says, without sidelining and defeating the Assad regime? I doubt it.
Okay, but just to come back to the point, okay, it's still, over the last few days, or the last couple of weeks, we have seen hints from Saudi Arabia, hints from Turkey, that they want to, or they're at least contemplating sending in ground troops, or joining in some sort of coalition to send in ground troops into Syria. Seriously? Really? Is that really on the agenda? I mean, because the moment you do that, you then get to put in all sorts of other players into the conflict who aren't there now. It's going to get so messy. Is that really on the agenda?
Dermot, if anyone have told me just 6-7 months ago that the Russians will get involved on the ground in Syria and beef up their military bases and bomb the heck out of Syria, I would have said, come on, why would Putin take such a risk? If anyone would have asked me that Obama will bring back the United States to bombing parts of Syria and Iraq after he pulled out the forces from Iraq, I would have been also surprised. And now, as you said, we have Turkey and Saudi Arabia. Now, we have, this is really big, but I'm going to try to summarize in a few words. Saudi Arabia is already involved with an Arab coalition in Yemen, and that war is not over yet, right?
Yeah.
And Turkey, of course, has its own problems, and I think the Turkish military is not exactly excited about getting involved in internal Syrian affairs. Because they feel that they will get bogged down in some kind of an Afghanistan, and certainly they don't want to kill Russians.
Well, they're right, aren't they? They're right.
Well, I mean, they're right to a certain degree, and that's why Erdogan has insisted long ago and throughout that NATO needs to come along, and the UN needs to come along, that this cannot be just a Turkish issue.
Well, now you have the Saudis, and one big question a lot of people are asking now is, what role does Saudi have to play in this unfolding drama?
Well, look, the Saudis are saying the United States has long asked that regional powers need to step in to help on the ground in Syria. So for 4 years now, the United States has hesitated to get involved, and they said, we will not put boots on the ground. After hesitating for a long time and getting involved in Yemen, now the Saudis and the Turks are saying, okay, we will get involved on the ground. Are you going to support us? Like you did support, for example, the Europeans in Bosnia and in Kosovo when they got involved on the ground? I think the Saudis are trying to call America's bluff. Because I think at this point in time, after the Russians got involved so heavily in Syria, I mean, look at it. There is what, 10, 11, 12? I mean, I don't know. Did you count them? 15 countries now got involved militarily on the ground.
The skies are getting really, really crowded.
I mean,
seriously, they're all bumping into each other up there, and it's only a matter of time before something really, really bad happens. I mean, there's not much airspace, over that particular part of Aleppo,
and guess what? The Turkish military and the Russian military are not speaking. They're not coordinating. There is no attempts at what the Americans call deconfliction between their various operations. Now, we had the French coming in, we have the British coming in, we have the Americans, we have the Russians, now the Saudis, and yes, this weekend the Turks start bombing. But there's also a bit of twist of irony to the whole thing. I mean, you would think there's some kind of a, black and white, or some, this side and that side. But now we have the Americans and the Russians who are competing over different, priorities in Syria. They are uniting to support the Kurds in the north. But now the Turks have just got in and started bombing the PYD in the north. And that's really just like putting, like throwing a hand grenade into the Syrian conflict.
One big thing is people just need some clarity in terms of what are the objectives for each of these countries, and what do they have to gain from being involved in Syria, because these countries involved.
Okay, so let's take the example of Saudi Arabia, for example, right? So Saudi Arabia.
This is a seminar according to Marwan.
Saudi Arabia looks at the map, right? If anyone, imagine our map in the Middle East. So Saudi Arabia looks at the map, at least since 2003, and thinks that the American invasion of Iraq have basically allowed the Iranians to get into Iraq, and they have a huge influence. And then they have Syria, and then they have their alliance with Hezbollah in Lebanon that's basically paralyzed the country. So when the Saudis look, they say, look, there is such a thing as the Shiite Iranian-powered crescent. So if Syria falls in the hands of the Iranians, we're going to have this huge Iranian axe within the Middle East. That's what apparently the Saudis are motivated by. The Iranians think that everything that's happening in Syria, notably the attempts at bringing down Assad, is directed against them and their ally Bashar al-Assad, who is also the ally of Hezbollah. So now we have Iran and Hezbollah getting involved in Syria, and we have the Saudis and their allies, the Turks, getting involved in Syria. So there are concrete and logical,
a series of people reacting to perceived threats. I mean, the way you're describing it is as though it's kind of some sort of grand. Kind
scheme.
Of nice, neat scheme. Some plan.
Calculated.
And you're calculated and very, very black and white, and very not black and white, confusing, sure, but with all the actors following a script. And it's not like that, is it?
I mean, if you would allow me, I would love to do some psychoanalysis, of Putin, of Obama, of Erdogan, of Khamenei, and so on and so forth. And I'm sure there's a lot of personal ambition, and there's a lot of personal chemistry sometimes. I mean, by the way, could anyone understand the relationship between Lavrov and Kerry, the Russian foreign minister, and the American Secretary of State?
No,
I mean, seriously, even like at the hottest of times, the guys are just schmoozing one another like there's no end. So yes, I mean, there are also other complicated factors.
Apparently, people aren't hearing me, even though I'm being loud. Sorry for that.
You're allowed. And just while you're doing that, let me just remind everyone that you need to step in, and please, we need to hear your comments. They're coming. We have Rahila, and we have yours truly, Marwan, and we're discussing World War III, maybe, or just a war of words between Russia, the United States, and the rest of them over Syria.
So to bring you back to your point, which I interrupted you when I was fiddling with my thing. I mean, we were talking. I don't think it's still there, but is it not? Oh well. Anyway, the guys will tell me they can hear me. But listen, so is this part of some demarcation going on? Some sort of piece of historical inevitability that's happening, where all of these players are all coming together and they're fighting on a chessboard that's called Syria. Is that what's going on? Or is this just a series of accidents that have happened and stumbled over time? I mean, that's something, people are just really confused by this because they can't understand why this war is still going on.
Right.
They can't understand what the players in the war have to gain from continuing it. They can't understand why people are suffering and no one is doing anything about it. I mean, it's a kind of, it's a kind of very obvious point from the outside world as to what exactly are these players doing?
Look, I would like to just distinguish between two things. One, to steer away from what President Obama said the other day, and really it was disappointing to hear him speak about why we can't do anything about what's going on now because this is a millennia-old conflict between Shiites and Sunnis, and there's some primordial issues over there, and there's nothing that we can do about it. While, excuse my bit of logic here or rationality, but yes, there are very specific powers involved and power struggles that have been going on at least since the no longer spring at all. But certainly these are recent issues that involve power struggles in the region. And regional powers have had their share of mistakes, failures, ambitions, as well as sometimes good contributions, which are very rare, by the way. But on the other hand, what you just asked, by the way, I think is key. And for some of us, you and I, and we've all been here at Al Jazeera the last few years, looking at it since it all started in Syria. I think Syria evolved in a sort of a series of mistakes and failures. I've never seen.
We just stumbled into this thing.
I'm telling you. I mean, 4 years ago, there were a bunch of peaceful demonstrators wanting reform, not regime change in Syria, right? And this thing evolved into some major crackdown, and then evolved into, 70, 80,000 people dying, and then evolved into the Iranians coming in, and then Hezbollah coming in, and then the Russians coming in, and the Americans staying out.
But that brings in the other thing. We have this one of our guests one of our comments on Facebook, talking about the fact that no one's able to actually issue. Joe and Luli isn't able.
Rahila, I wish it was just a question of them not being able to resolve the conflict. The problem is that they've all complicated the problem. 0.3 casualty of this war.
We were talking about this earlier, right? And I think it was in 2013 that the British Parliament took a vote to decide. The first one. Yeah, I remember the first vote when this was after there'd been some chemical attacks in Syria, and there was a vote in the British Parliament as to whether or not they should join a US-led coalition to have airstrikes against the Assad regime. Now, if they'd done that, then if they'd actually voted to participate in airstrikes, then do you think the course of the war would have been very different? Do you think we'd be where we are today? Do you think the dangers that we're facing today would be there, or what?
I think you're suggesting, and correctly probably, that if the British Parliament would have voted yes, Obama would have been a bit more bullish about going to war in terms of what they called very, very small attack. I think that's what Kerry called it. Very, very little tiny attack against Syria's weapons of mass destructions. President Obama said this is not America's red line. He said this is the international community's red line. What's the red line? The Assad regime using weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons against his own people.
Yeah.
Well, apparently he did, or reportedly he did, or he did. And Obama needed to act. I am the last person who would, and I think no journalist and no intellectual should support any war of any kind. But if the international community did come together and say there are red lines and we cannot afford another genocide in front of our eyes, especially with the use of chemical weapons, then I think certainly this would have been legitimate for them to do it if they promised to do it.
That's a big statement, Marwan.
It is.
That's a really big statement.
For them to do it if they have. I think the problem there is not between good and bad or right and wrong. The problem with Syria would have been between the lesser of two evils, because what happened since is another 300,000 people died. And instead of chemical weapons, they started dying by barrel bombs. Right after then, that's when Assad started using barrel bombs. So I absolutely advocate no use of force against anyone. But if someone uses chemical weapons against his people, I think he should be deterred from doing that again and again. Now, this was resolved diplomatically.
Hang on a second, hang on. If that's your point, well then how is it then that the involvement of the superpowers in this conflict now is a bad thing, when previously it would have been a
chemical weapons. And at the time, Secretary Hillary Clinton, was quite robust about it. And then Foreign Minister Lavrov called her hysterical for going after the Russians for not really accepting some sort of a measure against the Russians. But anyway, they made up right after that, and they worked out some kind of diplomatic solution for that issue. But that takes us back to the issue that President Obama, rightly or wrongly, I think rightly, has tried to avoid a major escalation in Syria, saying, look, we've tried in Iraq, we've tried in Libya, solutions or trying to resolve civil wars by military intervention doesn't really necessarily solve something, it complicates. But avoiding some serious decisions in Syria for the last 4 years brought us to this, brought us to Prime Minister of Russia saying, we could be heading towards a world war.
And that's really scary for people. I'm sorry, but that's a really scary thing to say. Is that one of the two superpowers, or one of three superpowers, is now actually beginning to warn of something like this, and people are trying to make sense of it. Now, if you listen to some of the questions from people we're getting, and I'm sure you're getting these too. Is they're all saying, right, okay, well, we're now at a place where we need to do something about this. So what do we do? Where do we go from here? Do we just let this play out until we end? There's a diplomatic solution, or do we actually see this kind of military action, and what are the risks associated with that, and so on? It's people are trying to make sense of it.
I think I guess adding to that is people just feel that these talks aren't really getting anywhere on purpose. There is no diplomatic solution. The actual solution is what's happening on the ground militarily. And all these Geneva talks keep on failing on purpose to get military advances activated, essentially.
Well, look, certainly the two main global protagonists, the Russia and the United States, and the regional protagonists, Saudi Arabia and Iran, have not really come to terms with the idea that they're going to work together to resolve the question of Syria. And that's why I said their role is not necessarily hypocrites. And the Americans think of the Russians as thugs today. And the Americans think that Russia is in Syria not for Syria, but for Russia. And Russia thinks the United States is in Syria for America, not for Syria. And so they both think of each other as cynics. And I don't see them with any good will at this point in time moving forward. Now, having said that,
sorry, but then therefore, this is Larry some hours ago sent this question saying there should be a UN ground force to keep peace while the parties talk. Is that not the way of doing it?
Larry, I wish I had your innocence. Well, you know.
No, that's perfectly straightforward. Don't patronise Larry. That's a perfectly good question.
It is. And I think the UN is a wonderful organization. I think it does great things and gets people together to talk at least once a year on the summit level in September and so on and so forth. But you know, I mean, you've been to New York and I've been to New York, and it's an ugly building.
It's an ugly building.
It's an ugly building.
Lots of talk.
It's an ugly building, and that's what it is without the will of its members. The United Nations is an organization that is homed in New York. Without the will of its members to act, it means nothing. And so when its members act, especially its government, meaning the UN Security Council, with its 15 members and with 5 veto permanent members, especially the United States and Russia, who have exercised that veto more than anyone else, if they don't act, if they don't come together, there is no such a thing as the UN. And there will be no such thing as peacekeeping forces. And there will be no role for our friend Mr. de Mistura, who talks in an incredibly boasting language about he's there to name the Syrian opposition and he's there to be the patron of the discussions in Geneva. And then he discovered how his back is completely unprotected because Russia and the United States have not really agreed, and Russia wants to continue bombing in Syria.
How much of this is really the US's problem? And should it be the US's problem?
Well, look, you know, the Middle East is this region where it was once upon a time policed by the British and the French, and since at least the 1950s, 1960s have been policed by the United States. Everyone understands that there is one policeman.
This is all about Sykes-Picot and everything else that happened in the
No. We're talking about it a later day. A later day thing when the United States become the policeman of the Middle East, right? It has a 6th fleet in the Mediterranean. It has a 5th fleet in the Arab-Persian Gulf, and it has bases throughout the region. And it basically is the country that decides when there is a peace process and when there's a war process and so on and so forth. So when there's a policeman, everyone looks for the policeman to act when there's a problem. It's like a prison guard, right? And when there are problems among the prisoners, everyone looks for the prison warden to step in and finish it or stop it or whatever. So everyone looked for the United States for leadership, quote unquote, or for a role to be played. Well, President Obama, apparently he's a hesitant emperor running a grand empire. And when you have a hesitant empire running a grand empire, everyone gets disappointed. For 4 years, people waited for the United States to act. After the chemical weapons, after the States never really got involved except to some pinpricks against ISIL.
Well, another way of looking at it, and this is a common theme with some of the questions, but I'll read this one from Arshad Mahmood, who said, and it's a point of view. I mean, you might think that it's a strange point of view, but nonetheless, it's a point of view. He says, World War III is upon us. Let this be known, as the prophecies quoted 1400 years ago, they are now coming true. So some people see this absolutely in those terms. And is that not part of the problem?
Yeah. Well, you know, I mean, I think you and I were speaking earlier before we started this recording. When people start bringing theology into strategy, or what some people can now call theostrategy, that's when you start worrying big time. And there is a good number of people in the region and outside the region have apocalyptical
Because
thinking about the
that's
region.
central to the way ISIS are, and they
There we
are
go.
provoking the hell out of this
There we
conflict,
go.
aren't they? Because it's in their interest. Because that's exactly the agenda that they
Yeah,
want to.
and
be
Daesh,
fulfilled.
Daesh in fact reckons, apparently in a very smart calculating way, that the only way they can get young people to come from England, where they're living better than they do in Syria under Daesh, or coming from Tunisia, or coming from Saudi Arabia, or Turkey, or from wherever, to fight that kind of fight in Syria and Iraq. It's because they're promising them the major battle that will end all battles. Not the mother of all battles, but certainly the war
It's
that
the
will
judgment
end
day.
all wars. Exact. Armageddon.
Yeah.
It's an apocalyptical thinking that has been going around. And by the way, there are a few people think like that in the West Bank in Palestine, and there are a few people who think like that in Tehran, and certainly in maybe in Washington, but certainly in the United States and so on and so forth. I doubt that there's many people like that in Russia, but I think we have a lot of people in Russia think that it's just as long as Russia can win the war, that will be just good enough. But be that as it may,
But that's also a point, isn't it? Because whatever people like, the Daesh might think about this, there are, I don't know, there are rational actors involved in this process, aren't there?
Rational or Russian?
Rational actors. Russia's a rational actor. Iran's a rational actor. America's a rational actor. And whatever you think about the policies, they're not going to deliberately cause Armageddon. They're going to back away from it. So all this is just posturing.
war of words. I think that's our big question, right? Is it really a potential scenario for war? Is it war of words? I would like to think.
Somebody just came in and waved a piece of paper
Yeah.
with a question on,
I've
which
got that
you got
note.
that? Okay, last one.
I would like to think that you're right. I mean, or I would like to think that this is just posturing, and that everyone will pull back from the brink sooner rather than later. Now, having said that, a lot of the world wars also happened by rational actors. I mean, the thing is, sometimes things happen, especially now. I mean, look at it. Imagine now if there will be, imagine the deconfliction doesn't work now that the militaries are not speaking to one another, the Turks, the Saudis, the Russians, the Americans, the Iranians, and so on and so forth. And there's been some real threatening statements. When someone like Secretary of State Kerry says, look, the Iraqi militias and Hezbollah needs to leave Syria, and if they don't, they will also be bombed. Bombed by who? How? When? What? Are you serious? When did that come into the equation? And when around the world, one thing is to think of it as cold-blooded geopolitical calculations with rational actors. Another thing is to think of mistakes out there that could happen right there. But having said all that, by the way, Secretary of State this weekend, and I hate to be quoting Secretary Kerry because I think he's really been one of the
leave your personal opinions out.
Exactly. What do you mean leaving my personal opinions out?
You're an analyst.
My personal opinion count here.
Okay.
Anyway, I'll leave my
I'm
personal
going to ask you then. I'm really going to put you on the spot. What is the solution?
What Secretary Kerry says.
But do we just need one big black hole in Syria for this just to end? Is World War III really the final solution? That's what
God, that's a scary thought, isn't it?
Look, I mean, look what
I can't believe we're having this conversation. Seriously, we're seriously thinking that's.
Look, there's about 10, 15 actors now in Syria, and they're all militarily involved, and most of them are major superpowers. I just read in the British Independent that the British Navy had just beefed up from a bread. I won't comment about that. but I was going to say about the logic of force. I mean, everyone understands that there is no military solution for Syria. Really. They all understand that, including the Russians. Everyone says so. It's not that I am projecting my opinion, on them. They all say that there is no military solutions. And look at the very recent history. The first year or so, 100,000 people died under Assad. The second year or so, another 100,000 people died under Assad and his Iranian allies. The third year, now we have Russia, and another maybe 100,000 people are dying, and still no solution. It's only getting complicated.
Okay. So if there is no military solution, there's no solution. You're saying, okay. So then what? We're facing perpetual war in Syria. Well, that's clearly not going to happen either, because eventually people will become exhausted, or they'll kill everybody, or they'll run out of munitions, or other factors will come to play, whatever they may be. So it's not inevitable that it should go on forever. It can't possibly be the case. There has to be some solution somehow.
I agree. And I mean, just back to be a bit more specific and just for everyone, especially our viewers around the world, to understand that there are, lights in that tunnel, right? And certainly we have the recipe for a solution.
There is beginnings of a peace process in Munich, or at least discussions about a possible peace process.
In Geneva, for sure. Now,
Geneva,
the so-called, by the way, it's very Orwellian, the international support for Syria, the friends of Syria.
Right?
No, and support for Syria, and really, I mean, the friends of Syria. I mean, with friends like that, who wants enemies, right? But anyway, be that as it may, in Geneva 1, they put out a recipe for a solution, and it's actually detailed. In Geneva 2, they kind of muddled with it. It didn't work out. And even later on in the UN Security Council Resolution 2254, there were some traces of a solution saying we'll look back at Geneva 1 and Geneva 2. So there is a bit of agreement, at least between the Russians and the Americans, about what the solution looks like. So it's not that they don't know what the solution is. Is there a will to implement that solution? Do they really think that solution serve their interests? Apparently, and here...
But what you're saying, therefore, is that a solution will come, but only when the players are ready for that solution. And then
one side gives in.
And when one side gives in.
But it doesn't seem this is coming through, right?
Well, not yet,
because
but
paralysis continue to exist, and the situation is getting ever more complicated. And as I was saying, whenever they try to do it from one year to another, it just got more and more complicated. So again, that's why, let me quote Secretary of State John Kerry, who said this weekend, look, we need to pull back from the brink. We need to start implementing some sort of a ceasefire, and we need to follow on the footsteps of Geneva 2 and the UN Security Council resolution and go back to Geneva and start back on the discussions. The problem is that Secretary of State Kerry talks as if he is the United Nations Secretary General rather than he is the foreign minister of one of the superpowers involved in this conflict. So he needs to decide: is he a power or is he a mediator?
Well, look, America. Let's state some things. America are not going to put boots on the ground in Syria. They may send in some special forces or something as advisors, as they've done in Iraq, but they're not going to put boots on the ground. They're not going to get involved. At least not this administration. And unless, who knows what will happen if there's a President Trump, then we might be facing a completely different world. But nonetheless, were that right now, it doesn't look like America's going to put troops on the ground in Syria. Now, in the absence of that, Turkey and Saudi Arabia saying that they might be part of a coalition to put troops on the ground, I can't see them doing that either. Can you? I mean, is that really likely? So,
I mean, that's another thing you mentioned earlier was, is this just really just calling America's bluff?
yeah.
Are they trying to force America into a situation where they'd have to do something like this?
Because that's something that people are saying all the time in the questions. This is a game of bluff.
So is it a bluff or not? By the way, I just need to remind everyone that this is Dermot and this is Rahila, and I'm yours truly, Marwan, and we are way past 30 minutes, but we're going to continue a little more just to wrap up these aspects of the conversation, because it is, as Dermot just said earlier, a huge potential of, if this at all is a scenario of a world war, anyway, over Syria. Are the Saudis calling America bluffs? You know what? I think actually they are. I think they are. The Saudis have just called America's bluff, and we're going to have to wait and see what the Obama administration do once the Saudis continue their deployment of their forces in the Turkish bases on the border of Syria. And as Turkey starts getting involved and bombing various Kurdish areas, and the Saudis are threatening to get involved against ISIL.
We haven't even talked about the Kurds in this, which is another complicating factor.
It sure is, and it's complicated in a, I was going to say it's complicated, but at the same time, now the Turks are coming in and start bombing them. So we have all these, multiple forces coming in a multifaceted conflict and just complicating the situation more and more. And that's why now the United States is going to have to take a position.
A bunch of people walking into a bar when there's a fight going on and deciding, right, okay, I'm going to use this as an opportunity to pick a fight. I won't get involved in the other fight, but I'm just going to go after that particular guy. And then somebody else is coming in saying, well, I'm not going to get involved in that fight, but I'm going to have a part of that bit of action. It's like it's just open season for all these people, all these players coming into just cherry picking what they want out of this particular conflict.
Well, ISIS just sits there on the sidelines and laughs at everybody,
rubbing their hands, thinking this is biblical prophecies. This is ideological prophecies coming true.
It's actually, it's not. It's the sewers. It's sort of everything that has gone wrong in this region is making its way and coming to life in Syria. Whether it is power struggles, whether it's sectarian conflicts, whether it's superpower manipulation, whether it's proxy wars, whether it's dictatorships, right? Everything that this region has lived through is coming back, and that's why we have all these, conflicting demands and conflicting fights, if you will, or fighters coming into the picture, whether they are jihadis or liberals, Democrats or dictators, foreign fighters or proxy, mercenaries and so on and so forth. They're all coming together in Syria, and that's why we have this orgy, of a violent situation in Syria, and that's why, as I said earlier, it's becoming more and more complicated. Now, does this mean that the Saudis and the Turks should get involved and no one should be fighting ISIL? No, that's not what I'm saying. Should they get involved? I'm not saying that either. What I'm saying is we have a recipe for a solution, but it's just it lacks the will of those who are sponsor of that solution to come to the table.
What is the recipe for the solution? What's the solution?
Well,
I promised he didn't want me to ask that question earlier on, but I think that's a really good time to ask this thing, because that also is coming in this.
Because we just hear everyone talking about we need to find a political solution, but no one is able to break down what that solution
what
is.
What does it look like?
No, look.
What does a political solution in Syria look like?
It's
Tell
actually.
me what Syria would look like after a solution.
It is.
Would there even be a Syria?
It is. Well, that's a different question. But there is a solution that says. There are three steps that need to be taken, three major steps. One, ceasefire, humanitarian assistance to those besieged areas and so on and so forth. Two, a transitional ruling council with executive authority to govern the country in a transitional period that takes to the writing of a new constitution and open and democratic elections that involved all Syrians for a democratic Syria, secular Syria, by the end of 2017. They've agreed to it. There are three steps. They're clear. The Russians and the Americans are on board. Guess what scenario? So it's clear and it's there. Now, there are some nitty-gritties like when will Assad be stepped aside, or will he be sidelines immediately in the beginning of that transitional process or later on? That could be resolved between the Russians and the Americans. But there is a recipe for solution. And that could avoid a third world war. And I've been told we're done because we're 40 minutes in. Dermot, Raila, and of course me.
Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. All right. And that's a wrap.